Ranata Flavio's son became seriously ill and needed surgery. Ranata, a single mother since her husband passed away 2 years earlier from the same illness, was now fighting desperately for her son's life. He was her only child. Ranata had married young right after finishing school at 18. Her husband, whom she had fallen in love with at first sight despite their 17-year age gap, swept her off her feet with his handsome looks. Renowned for her own beauty in their small town, Ranata had long black hair and big brown eyes that drew attention from all the guys, though she kept them at bay with her aloofness. Despite her initial aspirations for a career in acting, singing, or modeling, Ranata's life took a different turn once she met Javier. They quickly fell in love, got engaged within a month, and had a lavish wedding shortly after. Javier, a wealthy man, spared no expense, and their life together initially resembled a fairy tale. After a blissful honeymoon, Ranata soon became pregnant and happily embraced her roles as wife and mother, leaving behind her career aspirations. Her husband adored her, working hard to provide for their family. When their son turned 4, Ranata decided to pursue her passion for drawing, enrolling in art classes and eventually college. With Javier's support, she excelled in her studies, securing a future as a painting teacher in a children's art studio after graduation. Despite her fulfilling family life and blossoming career, Ranata sometimes felt a tinge of loneliness. Her old friends were distant, and she struggled to connect with other mothers due to differing interests and her reserved nature. Nevertheless, Ranata remained dedicated to her family and creativity, finding happiness and joy in her everyday life. Agreed to have her own business and income that she could spend as she pleased, Ranata looked forward to the future with joy and anticipation. Then, unexpectedly, Javier fell seriously ill. All the money he had saved for a new house and expanding his business had to be spent on treatment, but it was futile. Javier deteriorated rapidly like the flame of a thin, burning candle. Ranata couldn't believe it. In less than 6 months, Javier went from being a flourishing young man to a feeble old one. Despite the doctor's efforts, Javier passed away, leaving Ranata bitterly mourning his loss. She never took her exams or defended her diploma. Instead, she had to quickly find a job to support her son. Her parents helped as much as they could, but Ranata was determined not to depend on them. She realized she was alone, with all the responsibility for her son now resting solely on her shoulders. Over the next year, Ranata managed to somewhat improve their financial situation. She could afford to pay bills, her son's school fees, buy clothes, and even treat him to outings at children's entertainment centers, amusement parks, and the zoo. Life was slowly getting back on track, and Ranata even rediscovered her passion for painting during her free time. However, the wound left by her husband's death still hadn't healed in her heart. She poured all her pain, loneliness, and unexpressed emotions into paintings of profound depth. Those who saw her work predicted a great future for her talent, and Ranata began contemplating her own exhibitions. Suddenly, tragedy struck again. Flavio, her son, fell ill. Ranata was gripped with horror, fearing history would repeat itself and she would lose her son too. Doctors recommended surgery, which required a substantial amount of money. Despite taking on a second job and selling precious belongings Javier had given her, Ranata still couldn't cover the costs. Desperate, she reached out to her former college professors, asking for help in selling her paintings. Moved by her plight, they quickly found a wealthy patron who bought all her paintings within a week. Though grateful, the money collected still fell short. Ranata was on the brink of despair, considering selling her house. Every day, she balanced work and visits to the hospital where Flavio was admitted, just a couple of blocks away. One evening, on her way to the hospital, she stopped at a traffic light and noticed an elderly lady nearby struggling to cross the road on a red light. Approaching the old lady, Ranata asked loudly, "Do you need help?" The old lady looked at her, tears in her eyes, and admitted she was lost. She had gone with her granddaughter to a store, but ended up separated and confused. Ranata took her by the arm and led her across the street when the light turned green. "What was the name of the store?" Ranata inquired. I don't remember anymore, some big one with a bright shop window," the old lady replied. Thought that perhaps it was the huge supermarket on the corner. Ranata led the old lady there. As they approached, she noticed a young woman darting around the parking lot anxiously calling out a name. Maybe that's the old lady's granddaughter, Ranata thought. She guided the grandmother towards the girl. Seeing them, the young woman stopped and smiled joyfully. Bella, there you are. Where did you go? I've been looking for you for half an hour, the granddaughter said sheepishly, waving her hand towards where they came from. I was there, the old lady replied innocently. I hope you didn't cross the road on a red light. No, of course not, sweetheart. This young lady here helped me a lot, the old lady assured her granddaughter. The girl thanked Renata warmly, who smiled and nodded in return, handing over the old lady to her granddaughter. The young woman hurried off to the hospital where Flavio must have been waiting. Unbeknownst to Renata, someone had been observing her closely all this time. The next day, the young woman had a rare day off, her first in months. Reluctant to take it, her boss, an elderly man named Señor Gonzalez with gray hair, insisted. If you keep working at this pace, you'll end up in a hospital bed next to your son. Is that what you want? He asked sternly when Renata handed him some documents. She shook her head. No, Señor González. Then make sure I don't see you within these walls tomorrow. Go for a walk in the park, read a book, and don't even think about taking an extra shift at your second job. I'll find out, he warned. Señor González empathized with the young woman, knowing her story. He himself had lost his wife early and never fully recovered from the loss, spending most of his time at work, feeling lonely. However, he didn't want the same fate for Renata. The next morning, Renata woke up at 10 o'clock. Exhaustion was taking its toll. She got up and went to the kitchen to make herself some coffee. The hospital's visiting hours started in the afternoon and continued until the evening, so she didn't need to rush and could dedicate a few hours to herself. However, thoughts of Flavio, who missed her terribly in the hospital, weighed heavily on her mind. He kept asking when he could come home. Soon, my little one, soon, Renata reassured him, though her heart was breaking with sorrow. She did her best to stay composed and not show her son how scared she was of losing him. She had to believe and convey her confidence to him. It would give him strength to fight the illness. Renata repeated these reassuring words to herself over and over. Despite everything, I have to believe. Flavio won't die like his dad. Flavio asked again, and Renata leaned towards him, gently kissing his forehead and shaking her head. No, of course not, she said softly. You will live for a very, very long time. What will I be when I grow up? The boy asked, his eyes sparkling. It was their favorite game. Renata had long known that he dreamed of becoming a football player. You will play for our country and set a world record for the most goals scored, she replied, the answer that always brought a wide, happy smile to his face. Content, he fell asleep peacefully. Renata slowly left the room, holding back tears, and returned home. She knew this routine would repeat itself today and tomorrow, providing some stability in her otherwise shaky world. If only I could sell the house and raise the remaining amount for the surgery, Renata thought desperately. She waited anxiously for calls from potential buyers, but none came. Despite its high price and prestigious location, Renata held on to hope that buyers would come soon. As she pondered over this while sipping coffee from a delicate porcelain cup, she heard the sound of a message notification. Startled, she reached for her phone, whispering quietly, "Please let it be the buyers." The number was unfamiliar, and Renata began to read the message. As she finished, tears streamed down her cheeks. She closed her eyes, memories of her youth flooding back in a whirlwind of bright images from the distant past. She remembered being 17 when a modest red-haired boy caught her eye. His family had recently moved to their town, and he was the new kid in Renata's class. As he awkwardly entered the classroom, all eyes turned to him. He had an open and simple face, freckles, and a slight limp from a childhood injury, as Renata later learned. Meet Rafael Silvio. He will now study in our class, announced the cheerful and kind teacher, Sonora Sanchez, eager to integrate Rafael into their group. Sit in the third row by the window, Rafael, she instructed. Renata, who typically sat alone as her equally popular friends were in another class, raised her chin gracefully. No, he won't sit here, she declared quietly, assuming Sonora Sanchez would seat him elsewhere. To her surprise, the teacher grew stern. If I said Rafael will sit here, then he will, Sonora Sanchez insisted firmly. Renata's irritation flared as Rafael, red-faced, walked down the aisle and clumsily took the seat next to her, accidentally bumping her elbow. Could you be more careful? Renata hissed, moving away from him. Sorry, he replied sheepishly, revealing a surprisingly pleasant, deep voice. He unpacked his worn textbooks, evidently hand-me-downs from an older sibling, and set up his notebook and pencil case with meticulous care. During note-taking, Ranata couldn't help but glance at Raphael's notebook. His handwriting was remarkably beautiful, prompting a raised eyebrow of surprise from her. When the bell rang for recess, Ranata abruptly stood up, causing Raphael to nearly jump in place as he scrambled to let her pass. Clumsily, he bumped into the desk several times in his haste to exit. Ranata pursed her lips and, holding her head high, left the classroom. Finding her friends, she vividly recounted the encounter, feeling humiliated by the newcomer. And what about him? Is he at least cute, Clara? One of her friends asked casually. He's an eyesore, plain and simple, Ranata retorted. Red-haired, freckled, clumsy, and to top it off, lame. Lucky you, huh, friend? She chuckled with her friends, dismissing any hint of jealousy. At that moment, memories of her initial encounter with Raphael flooded back, contrasting sharply with her current struggles. The bell rang, signaling Renata's return to class. The redhead, Raphael, remained seated in his usual spot, hunched over his desk, engrossed in drawing something in his notebook. As Ranata passed by, she stole a quick glance at his work. He had sketched a wolf with a simple pencil, remarkably lifelike. Ranata, who had a passion for drawing herself, noted the accuracy with admiration. However, her social status and the norms among her peers prevented her from expressing any positive feelings towards someone like Raphael. Unbeknownst to Ranata, Raphael had taken an immediate liking to her. Despite never liking math, he found himself stealing glances at her profile and sketching her features in his notebook: a slightly pointed nose, big eyes, long eyelashes, a neat chin, beautifully arched eyebrows, and long black hair. The portrait turned out to be strikingly similar to the original, and Raphael, satisfied, signed it before tearing the sheet out and placing it in front of Ranata. Surprised, she recognized herself in the drawing and was flattered by the likeness, yet she chose to remain silent. Raphael, undeterred, wrote on another sheet of paper, "Do you like it?" Ranata retorted, "Am I really that ugly? You draw worse than a 5-year-old." She noticed Raphael's hurt expression but felt no remorse. It was how she believed she should treat someone like him, knowing his place, as she had been accustomed to with guys before. Despite her dismissive attitude, Raphael persisted. The next day, he brought a bouquet of daisies to school with a note, placing it on Renata's desk. The classmates whispered and pointed as Ranata, embarrassed, tossed the bouquet out of the window and defiantly faced Raphael. He sadly smiled but remained silent, continuing to sit beside her in silence for the rest of the day, and the pattern repeated the following day. During a literature class, Renata's pen suddenly stopped working. Raphael noticed and handed his own pen to her. Reluctantly, she accepted it, mindful of her grades in the subject. After class, Raphael waited for Ranata at the school's entrance, blocking her path as she exited with her friends. When he asked if he could walk her home, Ranata crossed her arms and firmly declined, stating she would walk with her friends. As Raphael limped away, he watched Ranata and her friends with a mixture of longing and curiosity. "He's so strange," Clara remarked, and Ranata nodded in agreement. Pilar asked teasingly, "Is he in love with you?" Ranata confirmed with a grim smile, "Definitely." "Oh my, you couldn't find a better knight in shining armor," Pilar joked, but Renata's thoughts on Raphael were far from knightly at that time. "Armor!" exclaimed Renata's friends, bursting into laughter. In response, Ranata groaned, "Stop laughing at me. You should pity me having to sit with him at the same desk." As she spoke, memories of Raphael's exceptional drawings flashed through her mind, stirring a twinge of shame for her earlier harsh words. But quickly dismissing the thought, she asserted proudly, "And no one dares to approach Rada Martinez, especially someone like him." Then something unexpected happened. It was a Sunday and Ranata had gone to the park to meet her friends. The sweltering, windless day was nearing sunset as Ranata lazily sipped lemonade through colorful straws, sprawled out on a blanket. Suddenly, she noticed Raphael limping through the park with a sketchbook and pencil case in hand. He settled on a bench near the fountain and began to draw. Renata's friends also noticed Raphael and started laughing, despite her pleas for them to stop. Annoyed by their lack of respect, Ranata abruptly stood up and left, declaring along the way that they were no longer her friends. Startled into silence by her sudden departure, they watched her go. Feeling unsettled, Ranata didn't want to return home just yet. She wandered deeper into the park, eventually finding herself at an old cinema where she bought a ticket for the evening show. The movie was deeply romantic, and by the end, when the main character died, leaving his young wife to mourn him, Ranata found herself in tears. She was unexpectedly sentimental, not realizing that fate would soon place her in a similar situation in real life. Leaving the theater, Ranata took a deep breath of the warm evening air, fragrant with the scent of flowers, and wrapped a scarf around her shoulders before heading home. Unbeknownst to her, Raphael had also been at the movies and was now following her. It was unusual for Ranata to return home alone so late. She usually had her friends with her. Feeling uneasy, she decided to take a shortcut down an unfamiliar, poorly lit street. Her steps echoed loudly in the silence of the sleeping town, and her heart pounded with fear. Suddenly, a large black dog leaped out of the bushes, growling menacingly and baring its teeth at her. Frozen in terror, she had always been afraid of dogs since childhood. Ranata stood her ground as the dog lunged at her feet. In a split second, something hit the dog on the head. It was Raphael's familiar pencil case. Turning around, she saw Raphael hurrying towards her, his eyes gleaming with determination in the darkness. The dog growled again, but Raphael shielded Ranata, urging her, "Quick, run home." She obeyed, fleeing as the dog continued to bark fiercely. Only when she found herself on a brightly lit street did she slow down and catch her breath. Raphael had saved her. Perhaps she had misjudged him, perhaps she shouldn't have left him alone. She glanced around, considering calling for help, but the streets were deserted. Everyone had already gone home for the night. Reluctantly, she continued home alone. The next day at school, Raphael appeared with his left arm bandaged. "What happened to you, dear?" Sonora Sanchez exclaimed sympathetically, raising her hands in concern. "Just a little unpleasant incident," Raphael replied casually, limping to his seat. "Now he's not just lame," someone chuckled nearby. Ranata bit her lip, determined not to lose face in front of the class. Her reputation had to remain unshaken. She kept her gaze forward as Raphael sat down beside her, stealing a glance from under his red bangs. Her posture and walked with purpose towards Central Park. Each step felt heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. The encounter with Raphael after all these years stirred a mix of emotions she hadn't expected. As she reached the park, she scanned the area nervously. Spotting a familiar figure sitting on a bench, she hesitated briefly before walking over. Raphael looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of apprehension and hope. "Raphael," Ranata greeted softly, unsure of how to begin. "Ranata," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of vulnerability. "Thank you for coming." They sat in silence for a moment, neither knowing quite how to bridge the gap of years and misunderstandings. Finally, Raphael spoke hesitantly, "I saw you yesterday helping that old lady. You haven't changed much." Ranata looked down, feeling a pang of guilt for how she had treated him in the past. "I'm sorry, Raphael," she said sincerely. "I was young and foolish. I didn't understand." Raphael nodded, his gaze softening. "It's okay. I understand." They talked for hours, catching up on lost time and sharing stories of their lives. Raphael had pursued his passion for art, becoming a successful illustrator. Ranata recounted her journey as a single mother, her struggles and triumphs raising Flavio. "I always remembered you," Raphael admitted quietly. "Your strength, your beauty." Ranata smiled faintly, touched by his words. "I didn't know." They parted ways that evening with a sense of closure and a newfound understanding. Raphael promised to keep in touch, and Ranata walked home with a lighter heart than she had felt in years. Back at the hospital, Flavio was sleeping peacefully. Ranata sat by his bedside, her mind still reeling from the unexpected reunion. She knew that whatever happened next, she had gained something precious, a rekindled hope and a renewed belief in second chances. Her and humiliated her in front of the whole class. From that moment on, she didn't trust anyone, she didn't even believe. In love, she transferred all her fears and insecurities to me. She was constantly telling me that I had to be strong and independent, never show my true feelings, and never let anyone close to me because they would only hurt me. The girl was silently crying. Raphael gently touched her arm and Ranata looked at him. She felt a Gentle warmth inside. She never told anyone about it. I think it's time to let go of this heavy burden. Ranata sighed, looking at the bright water in the fountain as if she were looking for answers. There's no doubt I'm not my mother. I'm not the others, and I can change. Raphael nodded in understanding. It's never too late to change, he said after a moment of silence. Ranata smiled gratefully at him. Thank you for believing in me, Raphael. I don't know what I'd do without your support. He nodded and looked into her eyes. I'm here for you, Ranata. Ranata smiled and looked away. I've been dreaming about you all these years, she said, and I realized how big a mistake I made in the past. I'm so sorry. She paused for a moment before continuing, and would like to try to make up for it. I'd like to start over and be your friend. Raphael looked at her with a tender smile. I'd like that, Ranata, from the bottom of my heart. The girl glanced at the man and smiled too. Suddenly she was taken aback by the feeling. She realized she was attracted to Raphael. She was attracted to him. She was shyly turned her head and quickly reached into the handbag. Raphael stared at the fountain and wondered how she felt. The woman looked at him and was pleasantly surprised. Yes, I'm sure, Raphael replied with conviction, his gaze steady on Renata's face. My friend is quite wealthy and he's willing to help. Money is not an issue for him. Ranata felt a mix of emotions swirling within her: hope, disbelief, and a touch of gratitude. But why would your friend want to help me? We barely know each other anymore, she asked, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. Raphael smiled softly, his eyes reflecting sincerity. He trusts my judgment, and when I told him about you and your son, he immediately offered his assistance. He's a compassionate man, and he understands the value of helping others in need. Ranata nodded slowly, still processing the unexpected turn of events. I don't know what to say. This is all so overwhelming. I never expected. You don't have to say anything, Raphael interrupted gently, squeezing her hand reassuringly. Let's just take one step at a time. Would you be willing to meet my friend? He wants to discuss how he can help. Ranata hesitated for a moment, contemplating the magnitude of Raphael's offer and the implications it could have for her son's future. Yes, she finally said, a determined look in her eyes. Yes, I'll meet him. Please thank him for me, Raphael. I don't know how I can ever repay such kindness. There's no need for repayment, Raphael replied warmly. Just focus on what's best for Flavio. That's all that matters right now. As they sat by the fountain in the tranquil park, the weight of uncertainty began to lift from Renata's shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope for Flavio's recovery, for a future where they wouldn't have to face these struggles alone. I never imagined we'd meet like this again, Ranata admitted softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Raphael turned to her with a gentle smile. Life has a funny way of bringing people back together, doesn't it? Perhaps this is our chance to make things right. Ranata nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. Maybe it is, she agreed, feeling a warmth spread through her heart that hadn't been there for a long time. As they continued to talk, plans began to form. Plans for meeting Raphael's friend, plans for Flavio's treatment, and perhaps even plans for a renewed connection between two souls who had once shared a brief but unforgettable chapter in their lives. And amidst the soft glow of the lantern-lit park, Ranata allowed herself to believe that, just maybe, there was hope for a brighter future after all. Spent the rest of the evening chatting about lighter topics, avoiding the weightier issues of the past and the uncertain future. Ranata found herself enjoying Raphael's company more than she had anticipated. His gentle demeanor and genuine concern for her and Flavio touched her deeply. As they walked back through the park after their meal, Ranata couldn't help but notice the way Raphael limped slightly. She wondered how much pain he must endure daily, yet never complained. The thought made her heart ache with gratitude and empathy. You know, Raphael, she began hesitantly, I never properly thanked you for saving me from that dog. If you hadn't been there. Raphael interrupted with a soft smile. You would have been fine, Ranata. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. They reached a bench under a large oak tree and sat down, the evening breeze rustling the leaves above them. Ranata stared out at the darkening sky, contemplating everything that had transpired in the past few hours. I wish I had known earlier about your struggles, she admitted quietly, turning to look at him. maybe things would have been different. Raphael shook his head gently. It's in the past now, Renata. We can't change it. She nodded in agreement, a pang of regret gnawing at her. Do you think we could have been friends back then? She asked, almost hesitantly. Raphael's eyes softened, and he reached out to gently touch her hand. Perhaps, he replied softly. But sometimes, things happen the way they do for a reason. Maybe we needed this time apart to grow into who we are now. Renata considered his words, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She realized that maybe their paths had diverged so they could find each other again under different circumstances that now seemed filled with hope and possibility. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Renata couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something new. A chapter in her life that she hadn't anticipated but was now grateful to embrace. Thank you, Raphael, she murmured, breaking the silence. For everything. Raphael smiled warmly, his eyes reflecting the park's dim lights. You're welcome, Renata. And under the gentle glow of the park's lanterns, two souls rediscovered each other, finding solace and strength in unexpected companionship. For Renata, it was a reminder that even in life's darkest moments, there could be light and kindness waiting just around the corner. To celebrate. Renata, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude, accepted Raphael's invitation without hesitation. She spent the evening with Flavio at the hospital, comforting him and assuring him that everything would be all right. The next morning, Renata visited Flavio in the hospital. He was recovering well, and the doctors confirmed that he would indeed be able to go home soon. Flavio was in high spirits, excited to finally leave the hospital. Later that day, Raphael picked Renata up from the hospital, and they went to a cozy restaurant to celebrate Flavio's successful surgery and recovery. Over a delicious meal, they talked about their hopes, dreams, and the future. I'm so grateful to you, Raphael, Renata said sincerely, her eyes shining with emotion. You've been my guardian angel through all of this. Raphael smiled warmly. I'm just glad everything turned out well for Flavio. And for you. They toasted to Flavio's health and happiness, savoring the moment of joy and relief. Renata couldn't help but feel a deepening connection to Raphael, one that went beyond gratitude for his help. As they walked back to Renata's home that evening, the streetlights cast a soft glow around them. Raphael stopped at her doorstep, a gentle smile on his face. I should go, he said reluctantly. But I'm glad we could spend this time together. Renata nodded, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. She wanted to say something more, something that would convey how much his presence meant to her. Raphael, she began hesitantly, would you like to come in for a while? I mean, if you're not in a hurry. Raphael looked surprised, then pleased. I'd like that, he said softly. They entered Renata's home, and she offered him a seat in the living room. They talked late into the night, sharing stories from their past, discussing their aspirations, and discovering common interests. As the hours passed, Renata realized that Raphael had become more than just a friend who had helped her in a time of need. He was someone she admired for his resilience, kindness, and understanding. Someone she was beginning to care for deeply. Eventually, Raphael glanced at the clock and stood up reluctantly. I should really be going, he said regretfully. But thank you, Renata, for tonight. It meant a lot to me. Renata nodded, feeling a sense of warmth and contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. Thank you, Raphael, she replied softly. For everything. They said their goodbyes at the door, and Raphael promised to check in on Flavio soon. Renata watched him walk down the street, her heart full of gratitude and a newfound hope for the future. As she closed the door behind her, she couldn't help but smile. The unexpected turn of events had brought Raphael back into her life in a profound way, and she knew deep down that this was just the beginning of something beautiful. Yes, Renata wrote. I would like to show you something, she read Raphael's message. Okay, Renata agreed. I'll pick you up at 7 o'clock if you don't mind, Raphael wrote back. Great, Renata replied. I finish work at that time. I'll wait for you at the office entrance. When it was almost 7 o'clock, Renata neatly stacked her papers, stood up from her desk, and walked to the mirror. She didn't know where Raphael would take her. Was this a date? Renata looked at herself. She was wearing a soft blue office blouse and a strict black skirt. She took out lipstick from her purse and applied it to her lips, then combed her long hair. She was ready. As she left the office, she immediately noticed Raphael waiting for her near the parking lot. He wore ordinary trousers and a light shirt with thin stripes. Renata breathed a sigh of relief. He definitely wasn't going to take her to a fancy restaurant. She felt light and happy inside. As she approached, Raphael kissed her on the cheek and, taking her hand, led her to the car. Renata looked on in amazement as he opened the door of an expensive black car for her. Is this really his car? She wondered, but didn't say anything out loud. Raphael drove her through the brightly lit streets of the city and stopped at a bright 4-story building. They got out of the car and took the elevator to the top floor. Renata had no idea where they had arrived, but when Raphael opened the door for her, she smelled the paint. Is this your studio? Renata guessed. Raphael turned on the light and Renata confirmed she was right. Yes, this is where I work. How beautiful, exclaimed the young woman. Then she noticed something that made her gasp. Renata couldn't believe her eyes. Raphael's studio was filled with her paintings. But how is this possible? Where did you get them? I bought them from your patron, Raphael replied with a smile. Renata thought she had misheard. Seriously? But where did you get so much money? Raphael looked into her eyes. I must confess to you, Renata. I don't have any businessman friend. I was the one who sent you that check. Renata covered her mouth with her hand in surprise. Yes, I became very wealthy thanks to my canvases. They sell for a lot of money now. I run my own business related to selling art, but I spend most of my time painting. You are so impressive, Renata said admiringly. You can also fulfill your dream and continue painting, Raphael said passionately. I will definitely help you. Renata moved closer. But why are you doing this? She asked quietly. Raphael looked deeply into her eyes and dared to run his hand through Renata's hair. Just because I love you, he whispered. With those words, he leaned closer and kissed her. Renata responded to his kiss, realizing that her dream about a journey to the sea would definitely come true.